This video is going to cover rounding. It's going to be fairly short since I expect that everyone has encountered rounding at least once before. However, what's important to recognize here is that there's specifically going to be some rules for rounding in physics, and these might actually be different than the rules you've learned about rounding in the past. So in terms of student learning outcomes, one of the big ones that this relates to is communication. So how are you actually communicating your answer, and the content of it relates to rounding, and a big part of that relates back to significant figures, which is covered in a separate video. So basically I'm going to talk you through the process of rounding, and the number that I'm going to be using as an example is negative 12.3456. Now the first thing to realize that in physics we're going to be talking about negative numbers sometimes. And the first thing is that I don't want you to be overwhelmed by that or think in any way that a different rule applies. So if you have a negative number, just work initially with the absolute value of it and round that. At the very last step, if you had a minus sign at the beginning, put your minus sign back. So that's the first step. So second, you need to know which is the digit that you're going to keep. So in this case, I'm just telling you to keep the hundredths, which is of course going to be the position of the 4, that this is going to be what we're rounding. So we want to keep this as our last position. We will be rounding that digit. Now in general, how do you know which digit you're going to be rounding? That's the question of significant figures, which is covered in a different video. So now we need to keep 1 past the digit that we're going to work on rounding. So we have to look at 5, since that's the digit after 4, but we really don't need 6. So I would encourage you to just throw that away. Don't think about that. And I sometimes see students make this mistake of really looking at later digits when they don't matter. So now we look at our number, which is 12.345, and we know that we are trying to round this 4, so we look at the 5. Now here is the rule that we're going to be using in physics class, which may or may not be the same rule you learned before. If the digit is 5 to 9, round up. That's it. You don't have to look at the digit before or anything like that. If your response to this is, well, what else would we do? Don't worry, you know the correct rule. However, there are some slightly more complicated rules out there that you may have encountered in a previous math or science class, and we are using the rule that if it is a 5 or higher, no matter what, you round up. So because this is a 5, our 4 needs to go up, and if you increase 4, you get 5, right? And so now we take this, and this isn't quite our answer because of that minus sign at the beginning, so our answer at the end is then negative 12.35. So that's the process. It's not very hard, and again, the important thing to do is identify whether or not this is how you already know how to round. Okay, the things to really know from this video is that the rule we're using is that if it's 5 or higher, round up. And the other thing to think about is to not be confused by negative signs, since you will sometimes need to be rounding negative numbers. That's all.